Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 17. Today we'll discuss using sources ethically. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to your weekly homework document as well as access to the internet. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll define the term ethics, we'll explore the ethical implications of using outside source material, and we'll examine key considerations for using sources ethically. All right, so what are ethics? This term gets tossed around a lot, much like civility. It seems that we hear it often, but it's very difficult to pinpoint down a more precise definition. So, in its most basic sense, though, ethics are a way for thinking about if something is right or if it's wrong. Now, with most ethical philosophies, there are four main principles that can help an individual best determine if an action is ethical or if it is unethical. Those four principles are principle for respect to autonomy, principle of beneficence, principle of non-maleficence, and principle of justice. We're going to use these four principles to really examine if we are using outside sources, namely for projects 3 and 4, ethically in our own work. So let's dig in a bit deeper, see what each four of these principles stands for, what they mean, and how they can apply to the academic research and writing process. Principle that we're going to look at will be principle for respect to autonomy. This principle advocates for the idea of live and let live. It also suggests that if one's actions only affect the individual, it is unethical to dictate their behavior. I think especially important and relevant to our course, though, would be the idea that the principle of respect to autonomy addresses the obligation to respect others, which we'll get into this in greater detail here in just a bit, but I think that circles back well to our discussions on agonism and civility, how we perceive and address others who may or may not see things the same way we do. The next principle we'll want to look at will be the principle of beneficence. This advocates that action should bring about good, that if you're going to perform an action, or in our case, if you're going to cite a source, it should be for good, well-intentioned reasons. So action should be framed, started with good intentions. So, with Project 4 especially, you can think about it as you're trying to make an argument for a solution to a social problem or a problem you recognize in your community. So right then and there, you're sort of in a good position to start abiding by that ethical principle, but it is always something to keep in mind with any type of research or writing that you do, is that you want to ensure that what you produce, what you write, how you go about sharing that information ultimately is designed to bring about the most amount of good possible for the most amount of people. In stark contrast to the principle of beneficence is the principle of non-maleficence. Now, this advocates doing no harm. However, most ethical philosophers recognize that there are situations in which harm cannot be entirely avoided. So they've suggested that where harm cannot be avoided, it must be minimized. Sort of rounding that out, the principle of non-maleficence suggests that we do not increase the harm experienced by others. So you can see where the principle of beneficence starts off by saying, okay, everything that you do, from why you want to pursue this topic to how you study it to how you circulate it and perhaps going about implementing it, comes from a good place and comes for the betterment of society, at large, whereas the principle of non-maleficence says, okay, well, in doing that, in pursuing those, I'm doing this for the right intentions, we also want to be aware that we are not inadvertently harming others or making another's experience worse in the process. And finally, we have the principle of justice. Now, this advocates an obligation to provide others with what they are owed. So it kind of gets down to the golden rule of treat others as you would like to be treated. And in regards to ethical philosophy, that would be treating others equally, fairly, and impartially. All right, so now that we have briefly defined the 4 principles of ethics, let's centralize it to our class and discuss how these principles and how ethics in general comes back to playing a role in gathering and using information in an ethical sense. And of course, I can't talk ethics without including at least one meme of The Good Place. I love it. Eleanor says, "It's like who died and left Aristotle in charge of ethics?" And Chidi responds, "Plato," which is completely the case. But aside from that, when we think about gathering and using information ethically, which is really what we are doing in projects 3 and 4, we want to ensure that our strategy for finding and locating these sources and incorporating them into our own works are done so in an ethical manner. I also want to note that we are discussing these conventions through a Western lens. So recall that different cultures, as they have different approaches to rhetoric, also have different approaches to ethics, especially as it regards gathering and using information conducted and circulated by another individual. So the way that we're going to look at this again is informed through more American and Western European practices. All right, so when we think about gathering information, right? When we talk about gathering information ethically, the first thing that we'll want to do is we want to access all information legally. How do we do that? So, first thing that you can do to ensure that your information is acquired in a legal and proper sense is to first use the library databases. Now, as a student, you pay student fees, and I believe in part of those fees go towards providing you access to the library databases. And so you have the ability to, as a fee-paying student, access these journal articles or these ebooks or, whatever other type of form your scholarly sources are taking at that point. Now, when we access information legally, we really are applying the principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, in that we are starting with the good intent that we are accessing the information on a platform in which the author has designated appropriate. Because we've done that, we are not contributing to the pirating of their work, and we are also providing the author with what they are owed. We also want to use search terms that reflect cultural awareness and will produce a desire to improve society as a whole. So this essentially is not relying on search terms or concepts that reflect any kind of negative stereotype that might be perpetuated in day-to-day culture. Because when we use those stereotypes, one, if you do come across anything in the scholarly databases, it likely will not be of quality work, and it will be work that just reinforces those negative stereotypes. So when we develop culturally appropriate and sensitive search terms, we are not furthering or contributing to the advancement of negative or ill-conceived ways to understand certain groups within society. So we also want to seek information that is relevant and will not intentionally or even unintentionally mislead readers. So we want to ensure that the information that we are locating speaks in the best way possible to the argument that we're trying to make. So for example, if you are saying, okay, well, I want to talk about, the application of this type of law in the state of Utah. Okay, well, that's great. Perhaps using a state like Nevada or Wyoming or Idaho might be a relevant case study. But to say, oh, yes, and in this remote village in Eastern Europe, even if it confirms your argument, the data and the case studies might not be appropriate to make the argument for implementing a law in Utah. And so you could see how that might potentially misread or mislead your readers. And so to really ground your argument in doing what is best right out the gate, you want to make sure that the content that you are seeking out and may potentially include is as relevant as possible. Let's move on. So after you have gathered the information ethically, we want to talk about using information ethically. So when we incorporate it into our own work. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to use the information as the author intended, and that is principle of respect for autonomy and principle of justice. So this comes down to, we don't want to put words in the author's mouth. We don't want to assume what they are saying or kind of create meaning that the author did not explicitly state in their own work. This respects the author and how they wanted to approach this topic, and also provides the reader with a very clear representation of what the author is saying, sort of outside of our own work and outside of how we are using them to support or perhaps to challenge in the form of a counter argument our own main argument. We also want to use the information as support for your argument and do not allow it to function as the argument itself. So, one issue in academic writing in general is that there are times when authors will say, wow, this work from someone else really gets at what I'm trying to say. And that can be great. And sometimes you might find sources that do just that. But you want to ensure that you are not allowing another person's work to speak for your own. Now, this gets at the principle for respect of autonomy in that you're not co-opting another person's argument and slapping your own name on it. It also comes down to the principle of beneficence. So you, rather than just to say, I want to carbon copy what someone else has said, you say, I want to do good by extending upon their argument or continuing the conversation as they left it to increase the amount of good that can possibly be seen by whoever your argument intends to benefit. Then finally, you want to provide all necessary citations both within and at the end of your text through a works cited, references, or bibliography. Excuse me. This speaks to the principle of respect for autonomy in that it gives your reader the opportunity to say, hey, I'm interested to learn what the author has to say, on their own. So by providing them a way, through your works cited, references, or bibliography page, it provides the reader an opportunity to say, okay, well, I'm going to go find that and read it on my own. It also speaks to principle of beneficence in that you are wanting, again, to further the conversation rather than sort of carbon copying what someone else has done, and also the principle of justice. So this individual who you're citing did a lot of hard work, right? We've talked about how extensive and, dare I say, excruciating publishing an academic work can be. And so by citing the author, by giving them credit, by saying their name and showing others how they can access their work, gives them the credit that they are due. All right, so let's chat about the lecture assignment. I'd like you to find a story that has occurred within the last 5 years that demonstrates the unethical use of information. This story can concern any facet of life, from politics to sports, religion, whatever, but it also must be a publicly accessible story in which information was used unethically. So think something like a publicly accessible blog, or a news story, or a social media post from an official organization or from a verified account. So it just has to be available for public consumption and not like a locked or a private group. Then what I'd like you to do is compose a brief write-up, so about 100 words, that does the following: provides a brief summary of the story, identifies the principles of ethics that were violated, and identifies the consequences, either real or possible, of the unethical gathering use of the information. All right, so what you're going to need to do is include the Core Lecture 17 summary and assignment in your Week 10 homework submission. Overall, your Week 10 homework submission should include the summaries and assignments for Core Lectures 17, 18, and 19, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. You'll want to get all of this to Canvas before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, October 27th. If you have any questions or if you'd like to chat about anything further, please do not hesitate to contact me via Canvas DM. All right, everyone, until next time.